styles on a page. You've done some animation, fading items in and out and changing their CSS values gradually. And you've also done a bit of regex and ajax, which are extremely powerful tools which you'll use a lot in your programming career. So we're going to try and put a little bit of that together in a form validation exercise. So I'm going to get you to do as much of this as I can, and I will lead you through it, but there'll be reasonably lengthy challenges for you to do. So I definitely recommend pausing the video when you get there and having a go at the challenge yourself. So form validation is the process of making sure that a form has been filled in correctly before you actually submit it. I'm sure you've been through form validation before when you come along and you mistype your email address and the form alerts you that it's not of the correct format for an email address, or your passwords don't match or something like that. So it's an extremely useful thing to do from the point of view of a website owner, because it helps the user correctly fill in the form and it very quickly alerts them to errors in their input. So let's find out how we do that. First of all, let's make a form. And because we know a bit of CSS now, we're going to try and make it reasonably attractive. So let's start by centering our form on the page. So your first challenge is to create a div which will be centered on the page and have a width of 500 pixels. All right, I'll do it like this. So I'm going to create a div with an ID of wrapper. Doesn't matter what the ID is, but wrapper is quite a common ID to use for a div that's going to completely contain your website. And then in order to center it, we apply some styles to wrapper, and we'll set the width to 500 pixels and the margin to 0 auto. And then that's the bit which actually centers it. And let's just put a little bit of code in there and get rid of my code from last time. There we go. So I can see I've got a nice centered background there. Great. Okay, so this is where our form is going to go. So let's just put a form input in. So your second little challenge is to create a form input and give it a name of email. Right, I'm hoping that you typed something like input name equals email and then close the tag. There we go. Right, let's style that a little bit. So try and make it a little bit bigger, give it a fair bit of padding and give it some rounded corners. Off you go. Hope you managed it. I'll do it this way. So I'll use input to refer to this and all other inputs that we're going to have. And let's just experiment a little bit. Let's call the width 200 pixels, the height 40 pixels. We'll give it a padding of 5 pixels and a border radius of 5 pixels. Okay, that looks nice. I think the text is a little bit too small. So let's increase the font size to 1.2 EM. See how that looks. That's nice. I like it. I'm going to make the border a little bit thinner. We'll go for 1px solid grey. Okay, definitely a more attractive form than we had before. Okay, I think I will increase the width slightly though. So we've got plenty of room to play with. Great. Now I'm going to show you a new HTML element that we haven't seen before, and that is the label. So we just use a label command like that, and the label tag has a for element in it, and that helps define which input the label is for. Okay, and our label is going to contain the word email. There it is. Great. So you'll notice that the label not only looks reasonably nice, at least we need to format it a little bit there, but it's aligned itself nicely in the center of the box. It's also particularly good for those people who use screen readers or a different way to browse the web. They can view the label, and they will know that the label is attached to a particular input element. So I definitely recommend putting labels in your forms. So I'm going to change the font to Helvetica. Take a look at that. Yep, nice. I'm going to make it a little bit larger, so everything matches up. Okay, great. That's had the result of increasing that a little bit, but that's fine. And I think with the label, I want to give it a particular width. For now, we'll set it to 200 pixels. Oh, you'll notice I've spelt label wrong there. Now, with my label, I want to make it a particular width so that everything lines up nicely when I've got several different elements on this page. To do that, I need to set the width. Let's go for 150 pixels. And I also need to make sure that the label is floated to the left. Now, when I do that, you'll notice that unfortunately we lose the nice center aligning there, so we're going to need to add a bit of padding. Let's try out 5 pixels, see how that looks. No, a bit more, I think. 10 pixels. Nice. Okay. Right, so we've got our email and then our email input. I'm beginning to think that email input is a little bit too large, so I'm going to change the height to 30 pixels. And change the padding to 7 pixels. Okay, I'm liking that. Looks good. Let's have a few more elements in our form. We'll have a phone number. So we'll just call it telephone, and we'll give it a name of phone. See how that looks? A little bit too close, I think. So let's set a little margin at the bottom of our inputs. Try 10 pixels. Great, that's separating out nicely. Okay, so email, telephone, and we're going to also have a password. We'll call this pass. Now, for password fields, you don't really want the text of the password to display, because if someone's entering their password and someone else is sharing their computer, then they don't want that person to be able to see their password. So all you need to do is change the type of the input to password. And then the browser will then not show any of the values that they're typing in, which is great. And then the last one that we're going to have in this form is going to be a password confirmation. Okay, great. It would be nice if they were all on a single line, so I'm going to increase the width of everything a little bit. So let's increase our wrapper to 600 and our label to 200. See how that works. Okay, nice. I'm liking how our form looks. Now we just need a button for the user to press when they've finished the form. And we do that with another input with a type of submit. And we set the value of a submit button to whatever we want the text on that button to be. So we'll just set it to submit with a capital S. Okay, great. I think we could do with styling that submit button a little bit. So let's give it an ID of submit button. Try and spell it right. So let's give it a height of perhaps 50 pixels. Okay, that looks good. And let's move it around a little bit. I'd like to line it up with the boxes on the top. So let's give it a margin left of 150 pixels. A little bit more. Nice. Then I think I'd like to change the width to 100 pixels. Okay, nice. You can style your form any way you like. This is just what I'm going to do. So now what we want is for something to happen when we click that submit button, and that's where we're going to do our validation. So we're going to use our form HTML tag to contain everything. And we'll give our form an ID. Call it validation form. Okay, so now in comes the JavaScript and the jQuery to do something with this. So we want our script to run when we submit the form. There's two ways we could do that. We could look at the button itself and say when the button is clicked, or we could look at the form and look at when the form is submitted. The latter is generally a better option because that allows us to look at the particular values of things within the form. And we haven't seen it before, so let's do it that way. So can you write some jQuery to select the form with an ID of validation form? Okay, hopefully you did something like this. Validation form, so the hash for the ID, and then validation form is the name of the ID of the element that we're going for. Now we're going to use the jQuery submit function. Nice and simple. So this code will run when the form is submitted, i.e. when the submit button is clicked. So we want to run a function. And this particular function is based around an event. So the event is the event of the form being clicked. So don't worry too much about the details there, but that event is going to be important shortly. So, and then we'll put just a test in at the moment, just to make sure everything's working as we would like it to. Let's put some details in here. It doesn't matter what we put in for the moment. Okay, excellent. So our JavaScript is happening, but then what happens there? All of the values that we've entered have disappeared. Now, if we expand this here, you can see that what's happened is the form has actually been submitted. And when we get onto the PHP chapter of this course, we'll find out a lot more about these variables up here. They're known as get variables. And essentially, these are the values of what I typed into the form. So we've got the email that was SDF and the phone, which was the same, and the password, etc., etc. So we don't want that to happen. So we need to stop the form actually being submitted. And the way that we do that is use a function called prevent default. So I take my event, which remember is this variable here, which is equal to the form being submitted, and I use the prevent default function. So that's how we stop the default event actually happening, i.e. stopping the form being submitted. So let's just check that that works okay. Again, I'll just put some demo content in there. So if we submit that test, great, the form is not actually submitted. So now we need to start doing our validation. So let's start by validating our email address. Now, validating an email address is actually a reasonably complicated thing to do, but we're going to use regex, which we're now familiar with, and we're going to use a pretty complicated regex formula, which we can get nice and easily from the web. So I'm just going to enter jQuery validate email address. There it is. And we'll go to the top result, and we've got a nice function here. So we've got our pattern is our regular expression, and you can see that's a really complicated long pattern. We're not going to go into the details of how that all works. You can read more about it online if you want to, but for now we're just going to use this function. So there we go. There's our function. Again, I'm not going to go into the details of how this really complicated regular expression works, but it does. So how do we actually use that? Well, we've defined a function here. The function is valid email address, and that will return a success if it is a valid email address and a fail if it's not. So we use it like this. So if is valid email address, and we need to put our email address into the function itself. So the email address, let's now go back to our form, is the value of the email content there. So if we were to change that to asdf@asdf.com, we'd want to get hold of that particular email. So what we'll do, we'll go back up to our form and we'll give it an ID of email, and that just makes it really easy to refer to when we're using our jQuery here. So a quick challenge for you. Can you get the value of this input with an ID of email? Did you manage it? Well, you just have to select the element with an ID of email, and then we use the jQuery val command, and that then returns our email address. Okay, so now we've got a statement that says if it is a valid email address, do something. We're actually more concerned about if it isn't a valid email address. So the way we do that is we put an exclamation mark in the front of our command, and this will look for essentially if this function returns false. So if it's not a valid email address. So what do we want to do if it's not a valid email address? Well, for now, let's just alert something so that we can test this function out. And make sure it's working as it should. Right, let's try this out. So if I put an invalid email address there, and it says not valid. Fantastic. If I put in a valid email address, it does nothing. Great. So you can experiment a little bit with that and make sure that it catches all of the different types of invalid email addresses. This regex should be pretty thorough. It should get pretty much every email address that isn't valid. Okay, so what we want to do is alert the user to this, but we don't want to have pop-ups that get in the way every time. So what we really want to do is have a nice area where we can put our error messages and the user can then see those error messages. So let's add a div above the form, and we'll give it an ID of error. And initially it'll just be an empty div, so we won't be able to see it at all. So in this case, if the email is invalid, we want to put an error message on that div. So there's your challenge. Can you make it so that if it's an invalid email address, it gives an error into the error div? I hope you managed it. It's reasonably straightforward. We just need to set the HTML of the error div to something like, please enter a valid email address. Okay, let's see if that works. Brilliant. Okay, that's great. So we've got our error message. I think it might be worth styling that a little bit. So again, quick challenge for you. Can you style this error message so it looks more like an error message? I hope you managed to do that. So I'm going to give the div some default content so that I can keep refreshing the page and don't have to fill in the form to get the error every time. And now we'll just make it a red error message. I think that'll be enough. Maybe a bit of a margin so it's separated out a little bit. Okay, great. That margin will also have the effect of pushing our form down a little bit, which in this case really doesn't matter. It might be that you want to hide that error message and only show it when you need it if you want to, but I think we don't need to do that in this case. Okay. So all good so far, but we're going to have a slight problem when we start introducing these other error messages as well, because what if we have more than one error message at once? Well, a good way to deal with that is to have a variable which is equal to our error. So let's call it error message, and at the moment it can be blank. So we don't need to put anything in that error message. In fact, let's set it to be empty at the start of this function. So we've got an empty error message variable. And then, so instead of actually setting the HTML of the error div to please enter a valid email address, we can set the error variable, so the error message variable, to please enter a valid email address. And the nice thing about that is, at the end of, once we've done all our validation, we can then set the value of the error div to error message. Let's just make sure that works. So we've got an invalid email address. Great. So now we've got our email validation working nicely. Let's do a bit of telephone validation. I'm going to copy this. But this time I don't want to validate an email address. I want to check if the telephone is numeric. I don't want any numbers or letters in my, I don't want any letters or punctuation in my telephone number. I want only a number. Now there's a nice jQuery function that does this for us. It's called isNumeric. So all we need to do is get our phone value, and we'll need to give it an ID, so we'll call it phone. So now I've got my phone number. I just want to check if it's numeric or not, and the function that we're going to use is dot is numeric, like that, and then we put brackets around our phone number there. So that will tell us if the number is numeric. We actually want to know whether it is not numeric, so we put exclamation mark in the front there, just like we did with the email address, and then we're going to set the error message to please enter a valid phone number. Okay, let's take a look at that. So if I put some letters in the phone number, we now get please enter a valid phone number. Great. We do have a slight problem though at the moment. If I enter an invalid email address and an invalid telephone number, then we just get the message about the phone number. So what can we do about that? Well, an easy way to deal with it is to set the error message equal to whatever the error message was before plus please enter a valid phone number. So let's take a look at that, see what that does. So invalid email and invalid telephone. Okay, so we've got both messages now, but we do have an issue with them being on the same line. So an easy fix for that is to just put a line break at the beginning of each error message. And again, that's going to have the effect of moving our content down a little bit. I think that's fine in this case, but you may want to play around a little bit with your own form. Let's just take a look. Invalid email, invalid telephone. Great. We've now got both of those messages. Great. So the third and final one that we're going to look at is making sure that both passwords are the same. So the next challenge is to try and make a third validation where you're looking at the two passwords and confirming that they're the same. I hope you got there. It's reasonably straightforward, I think. It's just a matter of giving your if statement the two values of the different passwords and checking if they're the same. So let's call them ID of pass1, and this one can have an ID of pass2. Great, and what we want to know is the value of pass1 different to the value of pass2. Let's put the vowels in there. And let's put that in the right place as well. So this essentially says if the value of pass1 is not equal to, put some spaces in there to spread that out a little bit, the value of pass2, then the error message needs to state that their passwords don't match. So please enter matching passwords. Okay, so let's just make sure that that all validates nicely. There we go. We've got 3 error messages there. And let's check if I do actually enter a valid email address and submit that, then that error message goes away. Brilliant. So it's all looking pretty good. All we need now is to do something if they actually managed to fill the form in successfully. So how will we know at the end of this bit of script whether or not they filled in the form successfully? I'll set that challenge to you. See if you manage it. I think the easiest way to tell is to look at the content of the error message string, because this error message string was set to 0 or set to empty at the beginning of this function, and then if all of these turn out to be fine and valid, then the error message string will still be empty. So all we need to do is say if the error message string is equal to nothing, if it's empty, then for now we'll just alert success. And if it's not, then we'll give them an error message. Okay, let's take a look at that. So if I put in lots of invalid data, I still get my messages. Let's put in a valid phone number. That's great. Okay, I'm getting there. I now want a valid email address. Hurrah, just need to make my passwords match. Fantastic, we've got it. So there you have it, a pretty basic but very functional email and telephone and password validation system. There are various plugins you can get for jQuery to do this for you, but it's always good to know how to do it yourself from scratch.